If you take any physics class or mathematics class today in the universities, you'll run into sections which are attributed to the great genius of Newton. Nobody leaves these classes knowing anything about who Newton was or who Kepler was or who Einstein was or who any of these guys were. You just leave with a bunch of mathematical garbage in your head thinking, well, Newton must be the greatest mathematician in the universe ever.
A student reading the published works of Johannes Kepler can follow step by step how Kepler thought as he hypothesized the organizing principles of the solar system. However, the associates of Newton selected those few results from Kepler that could be written as neat mathematical formulas, and then arranged them as logical derivations from a few initial axioms.
What is the gravitational force? If this is an object capital M, and you can think of this as being the Earth if you want to, and there is here an object little m, then I have to know what the forces are between the two. And this now is Newton's universal law of gravity, which he postulated. Universal law of gravity. He says the force that little m experiences, this force, equals, I'll put a little m here and a capital M here, so it is little m experiences that force due to the presence of capital M, equals little m times capital M times a constant, which Newton in his days didn't know yet what that value was, divided by r squared, if r is the distance between the two.
Read the letters of Newton's contemporary, John Flamsteed. Flamsteed is a real scientist in the model of Kepler, and he is interested about the inverse square law. And he's had some discussions with Newton about it, and he points out the people who become, who just wet their pants over it. What modern professors do, the people who did that in Newton's time were all the people who hung around the court, not the scientists. For all these fluffy people who are around kissing ass trying to get in good with some prince or some lord or somebody with position. They went crazy over Newton's ideas. The actual astronomers could do nothing with it. The Principia had no effect on observational astronomy.
In reality, Newton's infamous inverse square law can be easily derived from Kepler's principles, and other principles well known by the late 17th century. In 1618, Kepler discovered his so-called harmonic, sesquialterate law, which states that the ratio of two individual planets' years squared is always equal to the ratio of those two planets' mean distances from the Sun cubed. This principle, which yokes all planets to the same system, can be stated in another way. The ratio of any planet's mean distance from the Sun cubed to its orbital period squared is the same for all planets in the solar system. Later, Christian Huygens, a follower of Kepler, discovered the principles of infinitesimal changes in rotational velocity, which he called centripetal acceleration. Newton's handlers simply plagiarized these two discoveries as math formulas and derived Newton's inverse square force law from them. There are no new hypotheses in Newton.
The so-called consequences of his work, this idea of the belief in an absolute space, the belief in an absolute time, the belief in action at a distance through gravitation, what's represented mathematically in his inverse square laws, all stem from a form of religious belief that he tried to cover up with his adage, the I don't make hypotheses. What it really meant was, I don't want to talk about my hypotheses because they're crazy as hell.
The calculus was actually developed by the intellectual inspiration of the United States, Gottfried Leibniz. The evidence that Newton had independently created the calculus was supposedly tucked away in a trunk of papers which he had produced while a student at Trinity College. The contents of this trunk were to have vindicated Newton once and for all, to reveal his true genius for all the world to see. John Maynard Keynes, a bad economist and Newton worshipper, was able to purchase this trunk in the 1930s, and he delivered a lecture in the 1940s after investigating its contents.
So he bought this trunk thinking that finally all the work going into the calculus by Newton we found it. It's in here. So he opens the trunk up. He actually gives numbers of pages. He says, I found 100,000 pages of work on pure alchemy. Alchemy and black magic. Actually, he calls it Babylonian magic. He says there's thousands of pages on biblical revelation, on biblical prophecy. Nothing on calculus. There's absolutely nothing on science in the trunk. And these were all of his notes and so forth that he was taking at Trinity University. So the question was raised in my mind, well, if this was everything that Newton was doing in his spare time, where is the science?
The real Isaac Newton was not a scientist, but a Babylonian witch. The Newton myth was constructed in order to convince people that the universe were essentially unknowable, except to the high priests, who discover universal principles through a sort of divine revelation. The myth of Newton the scientist was propagated throughout Europe and into the American colonies in order to pollute the minds of all potential revolutionaries and crush the beginnings of the American intellectual tradition.
In the foreword to the Principia, a foreword which was written without Newton's knowledge, without Newton. This is something that was put together by Coates and Samuel Clarke, two of Newton's controllers. And in that, you can see what the actual philosophical, political intention of introducing this philosophy was, which was as an attack against the idea that there's something unique about the creative capabilities that exist in every human individual. An attack on the idea that human beings, as a species, as a whole, each and every one of us, have the capacity to understand how the universe was created. They wanted to attack that idea of knowability and introduce an oligarchical idea that you have a handful of people who've got direct access to special knowledge through some sort of revelation, and they govern things, and the rest of you are peasants who should shut up. And that's a consequence of Newton's philosophical outlook.
Like the first law, the second law only holds in inertial reference frames. Can the second law be proven? No. Do we believe in it? Yes. Why do we believe in it? Because all experiments and all measurements within the uncertainty of the measurements are in agreement with the second law.